Welcome everybody to the third seminar webinar we have here on the COVID crisis. Today we have an expert here on epidemiology and economics who will combine both, look at incentives and how this helps us to model economic behavior and also the epidemiological aspects of it. We're very happy to have Ramanan Laxminarayan here with us. He's the director of the Center for Disease Dynamics in Washington, D.C., but also in New Delhi. He joins us live from New Delhi, where he's very essential in the fight there against the COVID virus. Before I go further into his CV and his connections to Princeton, let me just say a little bit about the upcoming speakers. We have more speakers coming up. Olivier Blanchard will present next Monday. Then we also have Agnes Deaton, a Nobel Prize winner, coming up as well. And Hun Shin will come from the Bank of International Settlement, the chief economist. He will talk about international capital flows, how the current crisis affects emerging economies in particular. And we also signed up Paul Roma from NYU, another Nobel Prize winner, who will talk to us in the next few days. Let me go to today's speaker. Ramanan is a personal friend of our family, and we're very grateful that he took some time really to explain the situation going on and the modeling efforts going on, which helps us to capture the events here. He has a lot of things going on. He was very instrumental in the United Nations General Assembly in 2016. He was on President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, antimicrobial resistance working group. So he worked a lot on anti-resistance resistance of certain antibacterial medicine. And he's a voting member of the United States Presidential Advisory Council on combating antimicrobial resistance. Again, he's published and is editor of several books and volumes. And he's also a distinguished alumni from Birla Institute of Technology, BITS in Bilani in Rajasthan. And I would also like to mention he's a teaching here at Princeton, a senior scholar at the Center for Health and Wellbeing, and also at the Princeton Environmental Institute. And with this, I pass it on to Ramanan, who will take over the control. I stop sharing my screen, and then Ramanan will share his screen with us. And we're looking forward for a lot of great insights, what's going on at the moment, and how to better understand and how to model it. Thanks, Ramanan.
Thanks, Marcus. Thanks for that very kind introduction and for having me. So I'll go for about 45 minutes. Is that right?
That's great, yes.
That's right. Okay, I'll try to wrap up before in case there are questions. So let me try to share my...
I will take questions and I will wave at you. I will collect the questions and pass it on to you.
Sure. Let me try to find this PowerPoint slide. Hold on one second. Sorry. Let's begin at the beginning here. Got stuck somewhere else. Okay, so thanks, Marcus. So this is really around COVID-19, which is obviously, you know, everyone is now a COVID expert. So literally nothing much to really learn about the disease. But the interesting thing is that, you know, there's a lot of economics actually involved. But let me start from how I would normally, you know, talk about this, which is, you know, how long have we known about this? And the fact of the matter is that we've always known that diseases travel. You know, sometimes they travel slowly. So here is an example of slow spread. This is disease transmission for mutations that confer resistance to malaria. You know, it took about 20 years to get to Africa from Southeast Asia. Here's a slightly faster spread, which was, you know, these strep pneumonia 23F, which is now the most important, you know, strain of pneumococcal pneumonia around the world. And that spread relatively quickly. And since 2010, New Delhi metallo-beta-lactamase, which started in this city, you know, particular resistance gene, has now spread to over 150 countries. So we know this cliche, viruses and bacteria don't need passports. They travel very, very quickly. But we also know that, you know, viruses particularly, but also bacterial pathogens are constantly knocking on our door to try to get into humans because we're an attractive host for them. There's a huge population of humans. We make up about 30% of the biomass of mammals on the planet. 60% is of the mammals that we consume. So it's very productive for these bugs to get into us. And so if you look at the top, the number of emerging infectious disease events, that's EID, emerging infectious disease events, they have, it looks like it's been going up over time. And this was a paper that was published in 2008, so this was not quite done yet. Obviously, this publication bias here, because we're finding more of these better research or funding to do this in more recent years than we do earlier on. But fact remains that we still have numerous of these events popping up all around the world. Again, there's bias because they get reported in places like Europe and the US where they sort of show up. But on any given week or month, there is some virus that's trying to make the jump from an animal to a human being. What it typically is not able to do is then jump from one human to the other. That's a pretty difficult jump for that bug to make. And occasionally they succeed. So we have new emerging pathogens, and sometimes they are bacterial pathogens and they're drug-resistant pathogens. But sometimes they're viruses, and sometimes they're viruses and they don't necessarily cause a lot of damage. But every once in a while we get something like COVID, every 100 years or so, which has got the correct combination of stealth, lethality, and also of ease of transmission, which makes life really difficult for us. So, and the risk of zoonotic disease is actually concentrated a lot in Southeast Asia because of the close proximity of humans and animals, particularly mammals like pigs, but also close to birds, particularly poultry, which are being raised for food. So this is a uniquely South and Southeast Asian phenomenon, and which is why most of these zoonotic diseases, which jump from animals to humans, are, generally they emerge from part of the world. Sometimes more often from here. And these are what wet markets look like. Essentially, there's meat. I don't know if any of you have been in these, but basically, there's a lot of animals in close proximity, some alive, some dead. There's literally, bodily fluids and blood from these animals all over the place. And this is, a slide which I show my class. And of course, it's, this is how we think. I mean, not literally this, but people are in close proximity to pigs, and pigs are remarkably similar to us, and we can get, flu viruses from them, for instance, and lots of other things. Now, of course, we don't know how this particular virus came, but typically the phases, you've got an initial phase where it's just in the animals, then it's got to spill over, and it's got to spill over into the mammals or birds that are closest to us. That's this bunch. And then you've got human amplification after the domestic animal amplification, which happens first, the human amplification. And so we pick up the disease like right around here, but it's been happening right here, but we are very late picking it up. And usually we don't even pick it up here. We usually pick it up, much further along. And a lot of the work that's happened over the last, 20 years or so is to try to see, can we go backwards in this chain and try to pick it up as early as possible so that we have some idea of what to do when it does actually emerge. And of course, there's forecasting readiness that's needed here. There's early detection that's needed here. You need to control it. You need to have a rapid response. And if you have a rapid response, then you get to cut the peak over here. If you don't respond quickly, then that's your peak. And that's what ends up happening. But all of this requires a whole bunch of things to have happened way in advance, including picking it up as soon as it's in domestic animals. It's hard to do. And a lot of what we learned in this was in SARS. And here, there's behavior involved. In November 2002, there was a first report of atypical pneumonia cases from Guangdong. No one really took it seriously, or they told the Guangdong CDC to just shut up. February 2003, China had already determined that SARS was caused by a coronavirus. They said there was SARS, but they didn't say anything about it being a coronavirus. There was something called a Hong Kong transmission. I'll talk about it in a second. It took until April for SARS to be caused by coronavirus. So as bad as you think things have been with COVID-19, if we had been in the SARS world with COVID-19, the damage would have been far more extensive, because at least the Chinese had released a sequence of this by, I believe, by the end of January or early February, compared to what happened in the case of SARS. And in SARS, there was this Metropole Hotel, the 10th floor of this hotel, and literally one doctor from Guangdong who shows up there, spreads it to about 12 people in one night through the air vents, and that's how the disease spread around the world. It was literally just that, and that's where most of the cases really came from. They went to the US, Canada, Vietnam, Singapore, Hong Kong, all over the place. So in many ways, what happened with SARS changed our behavior, because it basically meant that countries were then encouraged to report diseases much earlier. And the penalties for not reporting was simply that WHO could then say you have a disease, whereas in the previous world, we were governed by what is called international health regulations, which didn't allow WHO to exercise that power. Unless a member country said that they had the disease, WHO could not could not release that information. And we have to agree, the first international agreements on anything, before there was a Geneva Convention on torture, before anything, were on health. In the mid 1800s, there were what are called the sanitary conventions, which basically were after there were waves of cholera that came through Europe from Asia into the US, killed literally tens of thousands of people in Baltimore or the US, substantial parts of the population. And the world agreed, listen, if you have cholera, you've got to tell other people. Otherwise, we can't really all work together. We can't take in people from you. So this idea of international cooperation around disease spread is really quite old. In fact, older than any other international cooperation. But there are still challenges here, and obviously things that can be faster. Now, where does behavior come in? Behavior is everything. So Brian Grenfell and I have, I started teaching this class about 11 years ago, and Professor Grenfell joined me about 7 or 8 years ago. He's been leading it since then, and I co-teach it. But the fundamentals of this class is we normally start by saying, listen, you guys are probably not going to remember a whole lot from this class, none of the math or any of this. But if you can remember two things, 10 years later to remember in a cocktail conversation, we'd be really happy. And those two things are, first, infectious disease spread. That's pretty easy. If you can remember how they spread and the math behind it, that would be outstanding. The second one is that human behavior is an important determinant of how they spread. That, we respond to disease, and disease transmission is not exogenous. It's something which takes our behavior into account. And there's a lot, which was done earlier in the context of HIV, which really showed this, which is, data from the San Francisco Men's Health Study showed that, as the prevalence went up, the hazard rate into infections, which means people's risk-taking behavior, unprotected sex, all started going down. So in other words, people were not just looking at HIV and saying, I'm just going to continue to have, sex without condoms. And this is amongst gay men in San Francisco. They really started protecting themselves. So what happens is that a typical epidemiological model, just by itself, the hazard rate and the infectivity in both the math in those models is that it's an increasing function of prevalence. But if you build behavior that people respond to an outbreak, either because they observe prevalence or they are tested themselves, that they then respond by taking measures to protect themselves, then typical economic models would show that the hazard rate and infectivity would come down. And in fact, epidemics stop because of people protecting themselves in response to behavior. And that's a fundamental notion which frankly has not made its way deeply into epidemiology, but frankly, not too many economists have worked on this either. Thomas Phillipson was one of the early ones, but he was able to do it after he had tenure at the Harris School in Chicago. I doubt anyone would get tenure at the econ department, working on something like this. So anyway, so bubonic plague, another example, going back way far, the simple mechanics of it is our fleas feed on infected rats, which ingest the bacteria and they cause the plague. They soon become infectious. When an infected rat dies, its fleas basically leave to find another host. And the fleas find other rats and infect them, so they spread the disease through the rodent community. So only when the density of rats is low are fleas forced to feed on alternate hosts, such as humans, and that's what really causes a human epidemic. So there have been studies which go back and try to look at records of plague deaths from the UK, because especially in London, the Brits are pretty careful about keeping records of deaths very carefully. And there were all these little peaks. And from this, it was possible to sort of work out a mathematical model that fit those data, and where basically the more rats you cull, the more the force of infection to humans. However, what do people do when there's a plague and they know that the rats are causing it? They pretty much just kill the rats. And killing the rats can be the worst thing during a plague, because then the fleas all come and feed on you. Whereas, what you should really do is be increasing your population of rats during a plague. Counterintuitive, but that's how that's where the behavioral stuff comes in, which is, people do things which are well-meaning but end up having an opposite effect. About 3 years ago, I wrote this piece for the Milken Review called "Preparing for Pandemics," and it was a lengthy piece. It was actually the cover, and of course, at that time, we thought that it would be a mosquito-borne infection that would be the problem. We were wrong. It ended up being a, viral pathogen. But fundamentally, the idea was this, which is, even though we concerned about, infectious diseases concern is going down because overall that burden is going down. A pandemic, what I've highlighted at the bottom, a pandemic doesn't have to kill millions of people or even hundreds of thousands of people to shut down international commerce. I mean, today we have probably less than 40,000 deaths. So even a few thousand deaths over a very short period is sufficient to inflict significant damage on the global economy just because of the psychology of things. And the rest of this article, which I've circulated, basically goes into why it is that countries don't actually prepare and why they don't report disease outbreaks. If China had reported probably 3 weeks before, and if other countries had taken that seriously, including Italy, we'd be in a very different place with respect to this pandemic. And there's other work that we've done, which is on incentives for reporting infectious disease outbreaks, which are not that great. So, we've modeled government's decision as a signaling game where a country has private information, but it doesn't know for sure if it has an outbreak. And, the summary should not be too surprising to any economist, which is that obtaining accurate information about potential epidemics is really about reporting incentives as it is about detection technology. But most of the world's resources goes into detection technology, as in, labs and surveillance. But that's not really what drives us. It's really about people, countries, regions, governments, local governments being prepared to tell the truth. And that's really where the challenge is. So this is a 2011 paper, it's quite far back. Now, getting to the
question here from Rohit Lamba, he wants to know whether he would like to know a little bit about behavioral responses. How can it spread or contain the epidemics? Perhaps can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So into the context of COVID?
Or in context of COVID or in context of other diseases as well?
So if you take HIV, that was easier because when prevalence went up, that people did not have unprotected sex. And
mind a little bit the modeling aspect, or in economic models, how do you do that?
So in economic models, the force of infection or beta is not in a pure epidemiological model, that is not a function of the observed prevalence. So in other words, we assume that the transmission continues to happen in a mechanical sort of way, regardless of what the prevalence of the disease is. But if you were to modify that equation, which is basically an SIR model or an SIS model, where it's basically a quadratic function, which shows how diseases transmit. It's usually beta times the numbers of infected, beta I times S. I didn't put any math on these slides, but that's what it is. If you made beta, the transmission coefficient, a function of prevalence, because people are observing prevalence and then they're reducing their risk, then you end up with diseases sort of with epidemics essentially closing out themselves faster because people are protecting themselves. Now, in the malaria case, the example is similar, that when people know that malaria prevalence is high, they do protect themselves. They might, wear mosquito patches, or they might actually, cover themselves up or not go out during the biting time. In the case of COVID, once it becomes known, then people are willing to self-quarantine or quarantine quite well. This is what worked in South Korea. South Korea's entire approach to COVID was you make the testing so widely available that everyone gets a test when they want it. But once they have the test, they know I'm positive or I'm negative, and they don't want to infect their family members or anyone else. So they go quarantine themselves. Diseases spread when individuals don't have information either truly about the prevalence or about their own disease status. And so when they don't have information on their own disease status, they assume they're uninfected, even if they have a cold or flu-like symptoms, and they go out and infect a whole bunch of people, including in their own families.
Speaking on this disease status, and Soumitra Chatterjee from Penn State would like to know whether there are genetic differences among the humans which makes them more susceptible to be infected or not. Do you take this in the model into account? Is this of first order importance in the models, or?
Well, for some diseases, it's true. Like, for instance, people who carry the sickle cell gene in Africa, which has been shaped by malaria, they are less susceptible to malaria than the rest of us because they're, they've adapted over time because of the force of, the selective force of malaria. But in the case of coronavirus, this particular novel coronavirus, because it is so new and for the first time, it's not like disease like TB that have been with us for hundreds of thousands of years, that there is nothing to suggest that the average Indian or the average European or the average African is any different in their lack of immunity to this virus.
Thanks.
So building models in real time, this is what it really looks like. I'll talk about it a bit later, but fundamentally the mechanics of the disease are really quite simple in the sense that it's almost like textbook stuff that any of our students from our class could do because it's really the simplest version. You have a population that completely lacks immunity. We never have that for any other disease. Influenza, some people have immunity, some people have experienced a similar strain, or some people have received the vaccine. This kind of event where everyone is completely immune is almost like a textbook example, but we never really observe it in real life. But we know what happens in the textbooks, which is that the disease just completely takes off. It's like imagining if you have a forest full of unburnt wood and ready to burn. It's like setting a match to it. The fire just completely takes off. And the question is how you slow down that fire so it doesn't overwhelm your system. But eventually, every single one of us will get this novel coronavirus. There's just no escaping it. The question is whether you get it today or in 3 or 6 months from now or a year from now. And the extent to which we can slow it down, we're able to protect the elderly populations that are most at risk. So, we've always had this model called IndiaSim, which is an agent-based model. And an agent-based model, to put it quite simply, is one where you have in a computer 1 million people who are essentially carrying characteristics of the average Indian, and their location, age, gender, and so forth is parameterized Indian data. And in this model, you have infection, but you have multiple sites of introduction of incoming passengers, and basically you have you have a population structure, and you also have heterogeneous mixing because not everyone is interacting with each other. Now, this is a class of models. We don't have just one model for this. The one that we're trying to use for COVID is a much simplified version of this because, for various reasons, it took a while longer to do. But we've used other versions of this model, IndiaSim.
Can you explain a little bit what the different SIR models which are typically used and the SIR?
Yeah. So we didn't use an SIR model here.
So many economic models, expectations play a major role. Do you model behavior directly, or you also people have expectations and maximize utility in your models?
So there's no utility in this particular model, but people do, and it's possible to incorporate behavior. At this stage, we've not incorporated behavior yet because we've not incorporated this idea about prevalence responsiveness yet because we have no data to parameterize this with. See, there are two categories of models. One are called compartment models. We didn't use that here. The compartment models are everyone belongs to a category of susceptible until they move into the infected class. And then from the infected class, at some rate, they move into the recovered but immune class. So it's a compartment model which you can describe with a very minimal set of differential equations. And you can solve those differential equations essentially to figure out, what the stability looks like. That's a very simple kind of a model. The reason why it's not that useful for a country with the complexity of India is that to build age structure to that model takes a little more time. To build the heterogeneity in geographical location is quite impossible in those compartment models. So in the compartment model, I wouldn't be able to tell you the difference between cases in Western Maharashtra and Eastern Maharashtra, whereas in the real world, that's the information that policymakers are looking for. Because remember, we're moving in the speed of hours. I mean, our team has literally not slept in about 2 weeks, and they are working round the clock around the world because the questions that are coming in are really, where do we intervene? where do we test? Where do we build the facilities? Where are we short on ventilators? It's very, very real time. And obviously in the academic world, we're not used to this stuff because we write models over a period of, a year or two, and then we publish them over the next 3. So we don't work in the time scales that we're working on now. But, this is what the front lines are. But you have to keep in mind, India shut down a country the size of India, the largest lockdown in the world, based on projections from disease epidemiology. I mean, you really think about it. They are looking at what's happening in the other countries, but they are shutting down based on what they think is going to happen in India. And that projection comes from, models like this. I'm not saying this is the only one that made the difference, but for various reasons in the public mind, this particular model, received disproportionately high attention because of an interview that I gave, which got me into a lot of trouble as well, by the way. But I'll get to that in a second. So we've used these kinds of models for all sorts of things. We've used it for transmission modeling for, pneumococcal pneumonia. We've used it for rotavirus. We've used it for just more routine stuff. And it's widely published. So there was a structure there. So our team knows how to do these models, but of course, that's not the same model we're necessarily using every single time. We might have a slightly different model every single time. And, the contact and transmission depends on the type of contact and with whom the contact is made. So these are highly variable by age. Kids have higher rates of contacts. Household contact rates are higher than outside contacts. And that's because, in Wuhan as well, you saw that a lot of the transmission happened within households rather than between households. There was also more transmission happening within healthcare facilities than outside, even in the early days in the epidemic. So this and the age assortative patterns are really important because that again represents the structure of a population, right? So this is what the age assortedness looks like. So this is 60-year-olds, and so you can look at the number of contacts on the top and duration of contacts at the bottom. And you can see that generally there's a lot of age assortative matching, even in India and rural India. So the 0 to 4-year-olds, the numbers of contacts are probably going to be the most of people of their age group. That's why you've got this diagonal, all the brightest or whatever, the darkest. And the intermixing is not that great. But that said, in India, this mixing between age groups is higher than in other countries. It's not that high, for instance, in the US, because all the elderly are down in Florida or there's some nursing home somewhere. But in India, because there are multi-generational households, a child or a young adult can bring in a disease asymptomatically and put their grandparents at risk almost immediately. So these household structures are very important in these models, and India is obviously different in that sense. Now, testing has been an important issue. As you can see, India has tested nearly the least of any country. Only Bolivia and maybe, Philippines are lagging behind on a per capita basis. And the test positivity rates, we don't quite know what to make of this yet, but they're all over the map. So these are proportion of tests that come out as being positive. And most countries have a higher positivity rate than India, but India has tested so little compared to the size of its population that we're not sure that the testing is representative enough or useful enough to actually draw some conclusion out of it. To date, I believe the US has done about 500,000 tests, although it started quite late. India to date has done fewer than 30,000 tests for a population that's 4 times as large. Now, again, the incoming flights are an important thing because that's what tells you where the epidemic's be seeded. Delhi, Maharashtra, Kerala, we're still working to put these into the model because it's still in a very crude fashion right now, but we can do better, of course, as we have more time and more modelers as well. But airline arrival data is really important. Now, the other part which is important is really transmission and reproductive number. Reproductive number is very simply the average number of people that an infected person will infect. And that really depends. Now, some would argue that, see, the rate for the rest of the world is about 2.3 or 2.4. And some would argue that India should be higher because of higher population density. And that's certainly true. But pushing in the other direction is potentially some evidence that temperature and humidity could be lower. So we don't really know. We try these out in sensitivity analyses, and these agent-based models take forever to run because you're talking about multiple interactions between a million population and over, you're running it on a daily basis. So it takes some time. But this is really one of the major things that's still missing. And there is another model from Imperial College which shows that if you had a three-month lockdown, then you could save about 38.7 million lives compared to having a lockdown that was initiated later on. And this model just came out yesterday, but it sort of validates our model when we said, if we're going to do a lockdown, you do it right away. No point doing it after a week or 2 weeks, because then you've not achieved the benefits of actually cutting transmission very early. And the peaks are very similar. Peak is about 56 million cases, over here, and it's about quite a bit less over here. But still, all these models show there would be millions of cases, and this is a model that's run for the entire world. And the suppression they think would have having suppressed it early, if you do it for 3 months, which of course India is not planning to do, would result in only about 325,000 deaths. So you can expect that if you believe the imperial model, that we are not suppressing it for 3 months, that our death toll should be somewhere between 325 and 2 million and land somewhere in the middle there. So we'll see. And obviously we're hoping that something is going to bail India out. Now,
can I interject with some questions, just because a lot of questions coming up here. For example, Rajesh from Heidelberg University would like to know whether this is a bigger deal, COVID-19 is a bigger deal than TB, because it kills approximately 1,300 people a day in India. Then there's some other questions concerning, is it different between men and women? And how does your model differ from the Indian Council of Medical Research?
Yeah, so I'll tell you. So first of all, tuberculosis, very good point. Lots of other things kill Indians, but not too many things bring people with respiratory distress all at one go, millions of people to the health system in a 1 month period. And that's where this is going to be different. There are simply not the ICU beds to accommodate all these folks who would need it. If this were, so just to give you the numbers, there are 8 million deaths in India every year. That's just the usual death rate. That translates to about 22,500 deaths a day. Now, if we took the COVID numbers, even at the worst that are being projected post-lockdown, the worst, we would probably think maybe there's another 2 million deaths if things went really badly. Now, 2 million deaths increases the death toll by 25%. If you were to spread that evenly over the course of a year or 2 years, it would not be noticeable a lot, because it would just overburden the system, but would not overwhelm a system. But if you were to take a system which is dealing with 22,500 deaths a day, and then you had death rates which were climbing to 4 times that number on any given day, psychologically it would just be devastating. It would also be difficult for the health system to really cope with, and of course lots of health workers at risk. And that's really what the damage is. It's not as if COVID, if it were at a slow pace of growth, would actually, be the most important thing that we worry about. I think that,
that is actually the lockdown itself causes some death as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Does your model account as well? Or?
No, our model doesn't account for that at all. And remember, the lockdown, there's ways of implementing the lockdown, and I think the lockdown has been deeply traumatic for many people, migrant workers going home. So these are the complexities of India. Maybe there are striking decisions that are made, but there are downside consequences to these as well. So, and they have to take the call, because they were not going to be able to build up a health system that could tackle the emergency that would have happened by end of April if there had not been a lockdown. So it was a question of, do we take the hit on the lockdown or do we take the hit on the disease? And they chose to take the hit on the lockdown.
2 more quick questions. Are the men and women different? And are Indians less prone to get the COVID virus because they have dealt so much other bacteria and viruses all the time?
No, I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. And already there are climbing COVID cases around the country. You should not, I don't think the reporting system is able to pick up most of these COVID cases or deaths. Keep in mind that at any given day, or in any given year, only 20% or 22% of the deaths are actually medically certified. 80% are not, which means we don't know the cause of death there. So imagine a poor person dying somewhere, maybe at home of respiratory distress. They would never be counted as a COVID death now because they didn't get a COVID test. So those are some of the challenges with the Indian system. And the last thing is men, women, yes, men are more prone both to get the disease and have severe disease than women, according to the data from China. Did I get all the questions there?
Yes, there's a list of questions, but you should keep on going with your talk, otherwise we get in the time constraint.
Okay, sure. So let me skip this and just get to the next one. So there are disease parameters. There's an incubation period. There's time to hospitalizations, about 12 days in the hospital. And there's contagious time, which is in non-hospital because they have to be at home. But fundamentally, this disease is growing under our feet and it's starting to pop up. So we're seeing clusters of deaths. And you have to remember that everything is amplified by population in India. It's a large country. Even if you had 1,000 additional deaths in India because of COVID today, the system could not pick that up, because if you have 22,500 deaths, adding another 1,000 deaths is basically another one per district. It's not going to be easy to pick up. Now, temperature and humidity, I think there's hope for some reprieve here. There's very limited data from China, which obviously this is correlation, that's not causality, that relative humidity increases, do bring down the reproductive number, better fit than for the temperature. But again, this is one study, lots of confounding going on here. So I wouldn't, I would wait to see if we have a little more evidence here, because we're seeing COVID take off in places like Argentina, where it's actually summertime right now. So it's not clear that it's not transmitting with heat. Now, most of what we know about COVID from a controlled experiment quarantining standpoint is from this Diamond Princess cruise ship, which is in Yokohama. And there were 3,700 passengers and crew members on that vessel. There was one index case in late January. That one index case then generated 10 initial cases by Feb 3rd. Feb 4th onwards, all known cases were isolated and all passengers were kept in their cabin. So it was a pretty decent quarantining effort. And on Feb 20th, when they were disembarked, only 619 cases, and isolation quarantine, according to the mathematical models by a Norwegian group, estimated that at the typical rate, there should have been almost 3,000 cases, and this might have prevented about 2,307 cases. About 634 finally tested positive, I think they measured on Feb 22nd or something like this, amongst 3,063 tests. And of the total cases, 306 were symptomatic and 328 were asymptomatic. Now, this differentiation is very, very important for India, because typically young people are asymptomatic. And we assume for India, because the Indian population is so large. So at the end of the Diamond Princess experiment, when we account for removals from the ship, which they did take some people off the ship periodically, that it was about 18% were asymptomatic. In the model, we assume about half are asymptomatic, which is because we think India's younger population may protect it to a greater extent. And of the remainder, again, these are dynamic, but if you had to figure it out, about roughly 80% rate mild, moderate, about 20% are severe. And we're trying to fit the data to the best available evidence from Italy, Spain, and the US. And so these are model fits and are not static parameters. But keep in mind, we have very little data from India, because the data from India are highly skewed. They only test people who got off a plane or someone who has been in contact with a confirmed COVID case. So the picture we have in India from the official data are both skewed and underreported. I think, ICMR knows this the government knows this really well. They didn't, there's probably a shortage of testing kits in India, and the tests have not reached everyone yet. And the mortality is about 1% of the symptomatic infections and about 2% of all infections. But keep in mind, mortality, although it's not yet embedded in our model, we're assuming this, but that's actually dependent on health system capacity. That is also endogenous. A moderate case of COVID can become fatal if that person doesn't have access to oxygen. You don't need an ICU bed, you don't need a ventilator, but just oxygen. So if you don't have the oxygen, and if you don't have system capacity, if that person is in a place with none of this, then you have some real challenges. So we project 4 scenarios, high, medium, low, We're obviously hoping for the low, but we may end up with the medium. And these are all prior to the lockdown. So all these were modeled prior to the lockdown. We have not yet completed our models for the post-lockdown scenario. So take these models based on the social distancing and other measures that were put in place prior to the big lockdown. And the big lockdown, we think very roughly from some simpler models is that the peak will reduce by about half from the big lockdown baseline and will be pushed out another month. So we both buy ourselves some time and some pushing down to the peak. So both of those are the benefits. But the big unknown really for these models is how you're building up these immunes through asymptomatic transmission. If you build up a lot of these immunes, that's good for us because then it's almost like a buffer, and it's hard for the disease to get through the immunes to reach the most vulnerable population. So this is what the predictions look like for these high, medium, and low. Sorry, Marcus, you had a question?
Rohini Pandey from Yale University would like to know, if you don't have a functional health system, does suppression help at all, or is it less ideal? Would you react differently depending on how your health system is functioning or not?
So actually, let's assume a hypothetical scenario where India had a great health system and there was a huge cost to the lockdown. Then it might have been worth reconsidering or recalibrating the lockdown. Now, I personally was not in favor of a national lockdown. I thought that it would be preferable to do state-by-state lockdowns driven by testing data. And that would have been better because there would have been some states for which the lockdown was just coming too early, like the northeast of India. If they have no cases, why lock them down? But remember, these lockdowns are political decisions. They're not driven just by this. So the concept of the lockdown was taken, but then they decided to do this nationally. But from just a modeling standpoint, a state-by-state lockdown might have been more productive because then you're doing it in a calibrated sense and might not even need a state. You might just need to lock down the cities. Keep in mind, this is still an urban situation. People come in, mostly Italian tourists, I'm sad to say, have brought it in, and they are mostly in the urban areas. There's no real benefit of the rural lockdown at this stage. In fact, the urban shutdown would have taken care of much of that curve flattening, given where most of the infecteds are going to be at this point in time.
Thanks.
So this is predicted infections. Now, obviously, these are changing all the time because these are from the 24th, so they're already outdated by about 5 days. So, the qualitative picture to take away from this is that we would have been looking at about 250 million total predicted infections. Remember, that's asymptomatic, hospitalized, and symptomatic at the high, and about 120 million infections, of which about 60 million would have been symptomatic. And so in the low scenario, we would have looked at, this is all pre the big lockdown. So remember, we're not considering the big lockdown in this, but we think it'll go down even further a bit. So we might end up at about 50 to 60 million infections over that period of time, at the peak. And that would still translate into a significant amount of bed capacity needed for peak hospitalization. So we are not out of the woods yet. We still have a ways to go. And this is the predicted hospitalizations from the disease. Now, children are important because in China, it was not a disease that was important for children, but the only study that came out from China on kids showed that a lot of them actually had moderate disease, even though they were less likely to have severe or critical disease. But the problem for India is that India has more kids in general than China or Italy. And also the other feature of India, different from China, was that China was a single point origin spreading out from Wuhan into Hubei province. India's is a multi-seeded epidemic into multiple international airports. So in some sense, we have a more difficult control problem than the Chinese did, which is mostly they had a locus to focus on. And we don't really have that one place where we can just knock the whole thing down. Now, kids have overall lower levels of severe or critical disease, but again, if you consider, even if it's a much smaller proportion compared to adults, because there are 130 million kids under the age of 5, that is a problem for India. And a lot of them are malnourished, and lack of nourishment is an issue, not part of our model, but just qualitatively, that's something to say that we are underestimating the consequences for kids right now. The second thing is, of course, lung capacity, other pneumococcal pneumonias, other infections, air pollution, smoking status, the fact that India has a large number of hypertensives, many of which are uncontrolled hypertension. About 1/10 of the Indian adult population is diabetic. All of these being risk factors for severe disease and mortality. We have not taken that into consideration. So ours is really, people thought these were alarming, but actually it's conservative because we didn't really know how to put that information in, because we don't really have a differential for these at the current time. Last couple of slides, just to say that, listen, it's actually interesting for an academic to live on these front lines, because this one video with a journalist who, I subsequently got to know, she's sort of seen as being, I think, more left-wing than others apparently. But as you know, academics don't go pay much attention to that. We just talk to whoever talks to us. And the projections which I had offered, I was trying to explain the science of the disease and calling for, if there were going to be a lockdown, for it to happen sooner rather than later. This video was apparently watched more than a couple of million times, apart from another video with a different interviewer, which got out quite widely and went viral. So a lot of pushback from from various folks, particularly online trolls. Fortunately, I'm not on Twitter, so I don't pay much attention to it. But pretty terrible slander and so forth, which gets to be crazier now. You see, I'm trying to get to that last slide. And then the last slide is really to say, and this thing happened just yesterday. So again, these are not things that you sort of worry about when you're just doing your regular work, but yesterday there was something which went out on Princeton and Hopkins Twitter saying that the logo we had used was incorrect, just the logo. And it then went, viral on Twitter, saying Hopkins distances itself from the study. The Times of India says this entire study is a fake news, etc., etc. It took only 5 hours between when this was discovered for Princeton to issue a correction, and the person in charge of the Princeton Twitter handle, all that she was saying is, look, that particular logo that you used was wrong. It doesn't have the words Princeton University. And of course, I was oblivious to this. But by the time that was corrected, it had already gone, retweeted whatever thousands of times, and huge sort of pushback there, and all sorts of websites on it. But just to say that information travels fast. And this is a different world when people actually are, most of the time we release disease models and nobody pays attention, even when it's peer reviewed and in Science or Nature. But then at a time like this, you put out modeling results which are interim, and then there's like millions of people paying attention to it. So this was something that we didn't know, and we certainly learned from that experience. But last, to conclude by saying, listen, we're not out of the woods yet. We've got some time to create a huge testing infrastructure. We need to contain local outbreaks here and then prepare for this big avalanche, which is now pushed back a bit, but it's bound to happen. And hopefully there'll be some reprieve for some reason or the other, maybe humidity, whatever it might be. But this is not over yet. So lockdown just buys some time. It doesn't mean that the war is over. So thanks, Markus. I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Ramanan. There's still some questions I would like to pass on to you.
Sure.
You have to run quickly to teach.
Sure. No problem.
But Kushal from the IIT would like to know more about the fact of reverse migration. Is this accounted in the model as well, or is this goes beyond the model such?
No. Yeah, we don't have the migration in the model just now because it just came upon us. Remember, the lockdown is very hard to model in a model like this. We'll have to make some assumptions. We'll try to get it into the model, but we won't have those results for a little while. Someone else asked about an ICMR model. Actually, in terms of order of magnitude, we're very similar to the ICMR model. The ICMR model assumes that something like 25% of Delhi will be infected. And I think our model got a lot more attention, and perhaps negative attention, because I was saying the same thing, except in millions of people. And they were saying this in percentage of prevalence. And maybe the right way to communicate this is to say 25% of India will be infected and people are not, going ballistic. But if you say the same thing as 25% of India is actually 350 million people, then it causes a lot more tension.
Can you say a little bit about the buildup of immunity? Do you know anything about this? People are very interested in the buildup of immunity, and how is it?
Very important question. Probably the most central question we're trying to address here. We actually don't know, because the buildup of immunity is really what's going to change stuff in India, if anything is going to change, which is that, we have a large young population. If asymptomatic carriers in this population, on the one side, they're transmitting the disease, but on the other hand, they're building up the immune class, it just makes it harder for someone who is infected to take the disease to, over time, it slows down some elements of the transmission. It also means that it will be a time before it sort of pops up and the disease curve just actually takes off. So the question is, do we end this lockdown period with 30% immune, but very few cases, which is what one would hope for? Or do we end the lockdown with 5% immune and a lot of cases? If we have the latter situation, we're in trouble. If we have the former situation, then we're in better shape. We have very little evidence from what are called serology studies that actually study, the buildup of antibodies to show how many in the population have been exposed to the disease. And in fact, there's only one unpublished study from, I believe, from Guangdong or somewhere from outside of Hubei that shows that maybe 10 or 15% of people would have been exposed. But we're urging, we're working with the government here very closely, and this is the one thing that's the most important thing for us to be measuring here.
So the other type of question which come up is like, to what extent should science be popularized and put on TV and all this? Should the scientists focus much more just educating policymakers, or should it be all over the place and perhaps misinterpreted? Can you elaborate on this? I mean, you had all this experience with some Twitter thing going around.
It's a tough question. It's a tough question. Sometimes, my own belief is that if you trust people by explaining the science a little bit to them, then they're less in the dark. And I just found that it was crazy to just tell people there's something which is catastrophic, but there are only 200 cases, but you have to shut the entire country down. Now, I think we've got to, communicating during epidemics is really, from things we've studied in the past, is really quite important. And at the end of the day, it's a matter of trust. If people don't trust the messaging that's coming out, if they don't trust the reason for which they're being asked to undertake hardship, then they don't take that distancing seriously. They don't take the physical distancing seriously. I think people now take that physical distancing because they understand, through online or WhatsApp, whatever it is, that they have to break that chain of transmission. And, even something simple like that was important. And that's science, breaking the chain of transmission.
So let me stop with two questions. One question is, people would like to know, can you say a little bit about the US situation as well? And then I'm coming as an economist, or many economists would like to know, what should the economists do? How can they incorporate this type of epidemic models into their economic models? There's a whole flurry of new macroeconomic models coming out, incorporating SIR models. But do you think that's fruitful, or would you say, we have to have much more agent-based models to incorporate?
No, I think SIR models are a good start. I don't think you need agent-based models for the macroeconomic stuff. I think that's good enough, because that gives you the general epidemic curve, and that's good. I would just urge that, generally one thing I learned from Simon Levin at Princeton was the reason I do this stuff this way is because he always said the most interesting and challenging questions are between disciplines. They're not within disciplines anymore. And I just wish, being someone trained in mainstream economics, that economists would step out and actually work with ecologists or work with infectious disease modelers, because that's what makes these credible on both sides. And I think sometimes that doesn't happen nearly enough. And in the past, SIR models have been used in economics papers, but done really poorly and without understanding these models. And then, you feel like you've incorporated them, but it's not really in there. There are some questions on the right. Do you want me to address any of those, or?
No, I picked from them.
Yeah, good, okay. Oh, you picked from those.
Okay, can you say a few words about the US and then?
The US is the situation that India is most scared of, because if what happens in New York happens in Delhi, then then we're really in big trouble. So I think observing other countries has actually, motivated a lot of action here. India is gearing up. There are, there are stadiums that are, that are being considered for conversion into, temporary hospitals. The government has this very interesting and clever idea of having ICU trains. So entire trains that are hospitals, because India has a tremendously large railway network. And so if you can, if you can bring the train there and you can treat people on the train, then you can potentially move these trains anywhere in the country at very short notice. I think lots of creative ideas of that sort are coming around. The only shortfall so far is really in terms of data and testing. And again, I don't know if it's an ideology thing, but I just believe that trusting people with data and information then enables them to take the private action to protect themselves. Underplaying the prevalence doesn't help, because we saw that during HIV. Countries that underplayed the number of HIV cases, like Botswana, like South Africa, really dug themselves in a deep hole with respect to HIV. Countries like Uganda that were very upfront in telling people, look, HIV is a problem, lots of people are dying of HIV. They put the prevalence number out there, then people protected themselves. So I think that's the way in which, as a bottom line, that's what the behavior stuff says, which is let people observe the prevalence. They're not going to hold it against you. They're not going to blame you for an epidemic that started in China. I mean, you've done whatever you can to protect yourself, but put the numbers out there, because then people will take it seriously and do what they can for the physical distancing and shutdowns. You don't have to shut them down; they probably do it themselves.
Thanks a lot, Ramanan. We really appreciate it, and we wish you all the good luck and appreciate all your hard work to save India and the rest of the world.
I don't know.
I think it's very, very essential what you're doing. I think you do a tremendous job, and we give you a round of applause, but you probably will only hear mine. And
thanks, Marcus. I'll take a beer from you when I see you next.
See you soon. Thanks.
All right. Take care. Bye.
And thank you to everybody who was joining us. And if you want to be connected, please send us an email at bcf@princeton.edu. Thanks for everybody for joining.